Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Marcus Bolt from England. I'm a member of the Subud Lewis group, and thank you all so much for attending this short presentation on Riduan Tomkins' life and work. Andrew is going to kindly share his screen and handle the slideshow. So Andrew, could we have the first slide, please? Yeah, I'm calling this presentation A Painter's Painter because that's how I experience Riduan. And I can think of no higher accolade for the sort of painter he was. He painted obsessively all his life, and with the help of lecturing, actually made a living from it. I think it was Henry Moore who said, "I eat, live and breathe sculpture 365 days of the year." And to me, this is the greatest gift God can give to a man. I sense Riduan would have agreed with that. Now, here we have a typical shot of Riduan with an ever-present cigarette held in nicotine-stained fingers. David Van Noordwijk reminded me of how he would lay stretched out on a sofa smoking, and the ash would grow longer and longer, but somehow never drop. That's quite an enduring memory of Riduan. Now, although I was acquainted with Riduan for over 40 years, he was always somehow popping up at Subud events, group, national, worldwide, usually with a funny story, a charming smile, and a ready argument or two. The year we spent working alongside each other in neighboring studios stands strongest in my mind. That's because he entered my world like a force of nature, and it was a whirlwind of a year, as everything often was around Riduan. Even so, there are many gaps in my knowledge of him, exacerbated by the fact that Riduan lived many lives and was a very private, almost secretive person. He was a Subud member, opened at Coombs Springs in 1958 when he was 17, and became a sincere and dedicated helper. He was a devoted Muslim, an art school lecturer, a professional painter and teacher, a foster carer, and a relentless hustler. He'd paint all morning and hustle galleries and colleges all afternoon. And that's just to name a few of the Riduans I was aware of. And although these various lives inevitably overlapped, on the whole, he kept them strictly segregated. Can we have the next slide, please? And despite making it clear that as a professional, he'd never exhibit with other less than professional Subud artists at Congress-type joint exhibitions, for example, he was invariably generous with his time and advice to aspiring painters willing to listen to him. Personality-wise, he could be irascible, manipulative, pugnacious, abrasive, and annoying at times. But he could also be warm and charming, caring, and a lot of fun. I think these strongly contrasted aspects of his nature was reflected in his work, and I hope that comes across in the slides. Riduan was born in Dorset, England, 1941, and from 1958 to 68, studied at Poole School of Art, the West of England College of Art in Bristol, Wimbledon School of Art, and finally the Royal College of Art, London. Next slide, please. These two paintings are, I believe, some of the works that gained him a place at the Royal College. Now, places at the Royal College in London are highly coveted, and from hundreds of applicants each year, they choose only a handful, the creme de la creme. Artists such as David Hockney, Peter Blake, Henry Moore, Frank Auerbach, and Tracy Emin, to name but a few, were all Royal College alumni. It's been difficult tracing the chronological order of his work, showing how he developed over the decades, and I hope you'll forgive me for any dating errors. And I remember asking Riduan once why he didn't photograph and keep a catalogue or portfolio of all his work, which I was trained to do and perform avidly. That's a job for my biographers, not me, he retorted, in the camp voice he kept for put-downs and relating funny stories. Next slide, please. These are two more late 60s pieces. Here one can see the beginnings of Riduan's painterly style, a figure or figures on a colored ground, elegant line, and further experiments with semi-abstraction while retaining a figurative element. Around this time, Riduan was showing in the reputable Whitechapel and Angela Flowers galleries in London and being represented by Betty Parsons in New York. Riduan was definitely on his way and being recognized as a major up-and-coming young artist. Next slide, please. Now, most contemporary painters owe something to the two giants of the 20th century, Matisse and Picasso. Riduan was a Matisse man through and through, seeing himself as a painter of the French school, for which, according to Riduan, elegant line, controlled brushwork, and rich but subtle color as strong texture were the hallmarks. Now, being a Picasso man myself, Riduan and I did not always see eye to eye artistically, resulting in hours of arty polemic. Riduan so loved an argument. "I'm not saying you are wrong, I just know I'm right," he would quote with an impish grin. Now, the paintings here, on the left is a Matisse interior and a balcony scene painted around 1910 in Nice. On the right, two works by Riduan's other great influence, the American painter Richard Diebenkorn. These are from the Oceanic Park series. Now, he in turn was inspired by Matisse's interiors with figures, but later dropping both figurative and narrative elements and becoming an abstract painter. Now, it's important to know that abstraction stems from the Latin ab, from, and tracto, pull or drag, as in tractor or extract, and so on. In reality, all painting is abstracted, taken from life, the physical, the observable. Nowadays, the term abstract painting implies an art that does not attempt to represent an accurate depiction of a visual reality, but instead uses shapes, colors, forms, and gestural marks to achieve its effect. Abstraction is the distancing of an idea from objective reference. Next slide, please. And here are two Riduan paintings from the 90s, I hope illustrating the observation just made and the following. The key to approaching early Matisse, Diebenkorn, and Tomkins' work is to accept that the gestural marks of the painting are as important as those immediately beneath the surface and appearing faintly through the layers. Because they believed every mark narrates the process of the work, showing where the artist has been, how he has struggled and explored. Now, interestingly, Riduan mostly painted in series. Can we have the next slide, please? Often working on 3 thematized canvases at the same time, each one informing the others, as he eloquently put it. Now you have the next slide, please. This slide shows a series of paintings Riduan did as a commission for Simon Guérand and his twin brother. My thanks to Hannah Deroux for the photos of the paintings. Can we have the next slide, please? And also for the detail shots such as this, which enable us to explore more closely Riduan's stylistic drawing and his brushwork, with a constant remodeling of the theme, which together create the final image. So, although Riduan addressed all the formal painterly concerns, composition, color, texture, etc., it can be said that his work also successfully blurs the boundaries between abstraction and the figurative narrative, but always with sophistication, grace, and wit. Now, Emile Zola once wrote, "There are 2 men inside the artist, the poet and the craftsman." One is born a poet, he continued, but one becomes a craftsman. And Riduan was indeed both poet and craftsman. Hospital corners, Riduan would declare as he deftly and neatly prepared his canvases, attaching untreated cotton duck over a stretcher, gripping and stapling until it was tight as a drum. Then he would make a simple linear charcoal drawing of the chosen subject matter. After came the first of 2 coats of evil-smelling size, boiled up in the kitchen at Loudwater Farm, always annoying the other guests staying there. Next slide, please. When dry, the drawing would be further refined before the next coat. And when that was dry, several coats of gesso, the white ground, each layer demanding the drawing and composition be restated and refined. The following day, when all was ready, he would begin to paint in oils. It was a pleasure to watch him work, mixing his colors on a large palette, diluting with terps and scumbling, hatching, dabbing, rubbing, creating texture upon texture. And he was very proud of his brushwork. The paintings shown here are, I believe, works created during the 1970s, up to Riduan's 1981 move to Canada to begin lecturing at the University of Guelph in Ontario. And in 1983, he was teaching at Nova Scotia College of Art in Halifax. Next slide, please. In 1985, Riduan was selected to exhibit in an international survey of recent painting and sculpture, a show held at the prestigious MoMA Gallery, that's the Museum of Modern Art, in New York. My thanks to Andrew for sending these scans from the original show catalogue. They didn't have the ability to print digitally back then, and a full color litho printed catalogue of 400 plus pages would have cost a fortune, hence these mono images. But it would only have been an exhibition guide for visitors could actually see and experience the original work. Next slide, please. In 1987, Riduan moved to New Zealand to become head of the painting department at the University of Canterbury, where he taught from 1987 to 96. In the late 90s, Riduan returned to England and taught at the famous Slade Art School in London for a while. Now, if my memory serves me right, I think it was sometime in early 2000 when Riduan turned up at Loudwater Farm, a Subud house in Hertfordshire. And I, as caretaker, let him stay as a paying guest and offered him use of the so-called pavilion, a somewhat run-down large shed in the grounds, as a studio. After a year or so, I remember him being conflicted over whether to remain in England or leave. Riduan was very peripatetic, almost gypsy-like, forever moving on. Next slide, please. Then one night, while he was having dinner with us in the caretaker's cottage, a phone call from a neighbour warned us that the shed was on fire and the fire brigade had been called. The shed almost burned down, but luckily most of his paintings had been recently sent to a gallery, so only a few were damaged, although most of his clothes and books and other belongings had been completely destroyed. Over the next weeks, group members joked with him, saying, "Perhaps the angels are telling you it's time to go?" But Riduan always came back with Freud's famous rejoinder, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." He eventually left Loudwater to move to Indonesia sometime in 2001. Next slide, please. While living and working in Indonesia and often visiting the Subud complex in Kalimantan, Borneo, he became a founding member of the Central Kalimantan Cultural Collective. And recognizing the needs of local artisans and artists, he put forward a proposal to develop the underused museum into a cultural center and also opened an arts department at Kalimantan University. Next slide, please. I like this quote from a review of an exhibition of his work. Tomkins' work is characterized by fresh, clean colors and features elegantly drawn figures, sometimes in relationship, sometimes tiny, overlaid with paint and engaged in a variety of actions. Loop the loop, flying or falling, juggling and hanging, tightrope walking, and so on. The figures anchor the lines, shapes, and colors and deliver paintings that successfully fuse abstract and figurative elements. It's worth noting that Riduan's work is held in numerous private, corporate, and public collections in North and South America, Europe, Southeast Asia, and New Zealand. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things I love about Riduan's work is their tight compositional balance. Every line, every brush mark and patch of color somehow so perfectly precise. Harmony is a word that springs to mind, something I sense Riduan really sought but never found in his personal life, but managed in his work. There's a subject for a whole new presentation. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of Riduan stories. I remember being excited by an article I'd read written by a Catholic priest who specialized in the history of religious icons and echoing Bapak's 5 forces construct. The priest wrote that an icon's gold leaf and jewels represented the material level. The wooden panel that it was painted on represented the vegetable level. The egg yolk used in tempera paint and albumin used as varnish represented the animal force. The whole then imbued with the power of God after the icon painter had observed a 3-day purifying fast before beginning the work. I read the article out loud to Riduan, who retorted, "Sounds like white magic to me." Next slide, please. Again, that sense of balanced harmony, that if one mark was moved, the tension would be lost and the whole would come tumbling down. Another Riduan story. I remember him telling me that after buying a pair of probably once expensive shoes from Oxfam, the next day, while refueling the ancient car he drove, until it ran out of oil and the engine blew up, that is, he poured petrol all over them. He went into the garage to complain, and when asked how much the shoes cost, he told me that he just blurted out, £120. Believe it or not, a week later, the petrol company sent him a check for exactly that amount. Next slide, please. These paintings are from his last exhibition in Jakarta, and thanks to David van Noordwijk for sending them. Next slide, please. David also wrote to me about his Riduan experiences, and they were strangely similar to mine. And I found the following so very interesting. We eventually became neighbors in the former Wisma Subud nunnery for a few years. Very early on, in 2001, when I took him to the hospital where they would tell him about his cancer. I was just there, I don't know why. He'd asked me to come, I suppose, but why I was there was never clear. He just mentioned the diagnosis, kidney cancer, and that was that. In the years that followed, he never brought it up again, ever. As far as we knew, he just continued as if everything was normal. But Riduan finally died in Indonesia in 2009. Can we have the next slide, please? And the next slide now, please. Yeah. Thank you. Many years ago, I studied art therapy. In this type of work, every mark made in an image or painting is believed to be a psychic snail trail, reflecting aspects of the maker's inner world and experience. And this can be read and interpreted by the maker under the guidance of the therapist or within a group. When I discovered from the feedback after the original presentation how much Ridwan was loved and appreciated, and how he had twice become a foster parent, plus all the stories of his kindnesses and spiritual support of others, I suddenly saw that his painterly duality of working the abstract against and with the figurative narrative also represented or reflected that same duality in himself, the loving, caring, fun person with the darker, harder side of his nature. This made me see his work in a different light. It was as though he strived to balance the abstract and the figurative into a living work of art. So in his life, he strove to achieve the same balance through his adopted religion, Islam, and his practice of the Latihan Kejuan. In other words, he truly wanted to be a better person, a complete human being, reflecting perhaps the perfection he strove for in his work. Yet again, the one informing the other, perhaps. Now, let me finish with a typical Ridwanism, to be read aloud in the camp voice he affected when spinning a yarn. He'd probably say exactly this if he could have listened to tonight's presentation, and maybe he is. Now, that's enough about me. Let's talk about you. What do you think of me? He was a great painter, a painter's painter, and a raconteur, a joker, a teacher, a philosopher in the true sense of a lover of wisdom, a polemicist, a wanderer, a creative, a carer, and a good friend. I really do miss him still, and all his contrariness. Thank you all for listening.